Well, hello everybody and welcome to another episode, and today we're going to take a look at some fast 135mm lenses. That is 135mm lenses with a maximum aperture of f2.8. I have looked at a couple of such lenses in the past. I looked at the Minolta MD 135 2.8, very kindly lent to me by viewer Ava Vickman, so thanks Ava. I've still got the images, hope everything's going well. And I've also got a Tair 11. I've also used a Tair 11, which is a Russian lens, I think made by KMZ, do correct me if I'm wrong. That was lent to me by viewer Derek Holmes, so thanks again Derek, and I hope all's well with you. Now those are my gold standards for fast 135s, especially the Tair 11. And today what we're going to do is we're going to compare two cheaper, much cheaper fast 135mm with those two lenses, the Minolta and the Tair. So we've got, what have we got? Let's have a look. This is the Pentacon Auto 2.8 135. It's the M42 mount version, not the later PB Praktica bayonet mount version. And we've also got this Vivitar 135mm 2.8 Auto Telephoto. So two pretty cheap lenses. One was a third-party lens, that's the Vivitar, and another was the Pentacon, which was an East German lens, and of course at that time East Germany was part of the socialist countries, the former communist countries, and their photographic equipment was always rather cheaper, sold over here rather more cheaply than the Western lenses. So let's see how they get on. So let's begin with the Vivitar lens, which is this one. It's a very, very solidly made lens, as all of these vintage lenses were. Very few of them were had any plastic parts. I think this one has maybe has a plastic aperture ring. In fact, I think even that's metal. Let's have a closer look. Right, so there's our Vivitar lens. It's got a little hood that comes out. I must admit the hood doesn't do too much to protect it against light, but at least it does something. It's got a nice big focus ring here that turns very, very smoothly. It's very, very nicely engineered in the manner of the old lenses. We've got a depth of field scale here. Are we focused? Yes, we are. We've got a depth of field scale here, and then we've got the aperture ring right at the back. And the maximum is 2.8 and the minimum is 22. So quite a range of adjustment there. And this promises to be a lens that we can use in fairly low light. The minimum focus distance is 1.4 meters. I don't know if you can see that there. 1.4 meters, and the corresponding number of feet, about, I don't know, 4 feet or so. But it doesn't matter because it's got a lot of reach, being a fairly long lens. There's the front, beautiful big glass elements as you'd expect, and it all looks very promising. But let's see how it actually performs. Well, I have to admit, I'd expected rather better, and at first I was a little disappointed by the performance of this lens. It's really not sharp at all. It's a little tricky to focus. And the focus peaking on my Sony A7, which is what I shot it on, it doesn't work terribly well with low contrast lenses, and there's something about this lens that makes the focus peaking not work terribly well. So it's a slightly tricky lens to use. It's not particularly sharp. Many lenses are not very sharp wide open, but this one's really soft. I mean, proper soft, softer than you could reasonably expect. In fact, it's kind of Helios 40 soft. If you don't know about the Helios 40, it's an old Russian lens, 85mm f1.5. It's very famous for giving all sorts of exotic swirly blur, but if you shoot it wide open, but by the same token, if you shoot it wide open, it's very, very soft indeed. This is on a par with that lens for softness at f2.8. I don't know if I've got hold of a dodgy copy here, a copy that might need a little bit of repair and servicing, but I don't think so. All the elements seem to be seated properly. I just don't think it's a terribly sharp lens. It sharpens up if you stop it down, and it does become acceptable at around about 5.6 or f8. But as I say, I did expect better, and I was very surprised by the amount of softness that this lens was giving. So it's clearly not an inherently sharp lens, and it's also a fairly low contrast lens. There's not a lot of range between the blacks and the whites. Everything's a little bit washed out. It works kind of nicely for black and white, but in colour things are quite washed out and a little bit weak. These are not pumped up, strong colours by any means. They're not even in the Pentax tradition muted, but also quite saturated. So perhaps best used for black and white, this one. So I found myself feeling a little disappointed with this lens and thinking to myself, gosh, what can I give my viewers about this lens? But it turns out it does have a redeeming quality, and quite an extraordinary one, because in the area of background blur, I had a big surprise, and in a good way. I've rarely seen so much blur, and I've rarely seen blur of the kind, of the type, of the quality that this lens makes. It bubbles at any opportunity. There are certain lenses that are known as soap bubble lenses. Well, this is a lens where somebody's left the tap running, left the soap pouring in, and the bubbles have filled the kitchen. There are so many bubbles with this one, it just can't help itself. It just wants to bubble and bubble and bubble, and it does make some really beautiful, really extraordinary background blur as a result, and I was really quite knocked out by it. It's a bubble monster, and honestly, I think this is best considered, like the Helios 40, as an art lens. If you do portraits with this lens, they are going to look stunning, especially if you have some specular highlights, some little points of light at the right distance from the background, maybe about 10-15 feet away, that can make those bubbles and can really bring your background to life. This really is a vivacious, living, energetic sort of lens. It's technically, at least my copy, not that great, but artistically I think it's absolutely fantastic, and in that sense this lens is a real hidden gem. I would say, I'm going to stick my neck out and I'm going to say that this lens, or at least my copy of it, is a great budget replacement for the magnificent and rather expensive Helios 40, and there are not many lenses you can buy for 30 quid or so that will do that. So a great art lens. If you want kooky background, get one of these. Bargain at the price. 30 quid for one of these as against 300 for a Helios 40. That's really a no-brainer. Alright, so next let's have a look at our Pentacon 135 f2.8, a nice fast 135 from East Germany, and just like the Vivitar, In the manner of all the old vintage lenses, it's beautifully made, it's all metal, everything is nice and precise and engineered on it. Let me give you a closer look. There we go. So there we can see, I hope, our Pentacon 135, and you can see it's got a hood, sliding hood, same as the other one had. It's rather deeper, so it does actually help to shield light rather better. Proudly states that it's made in the German Democratic Republic. The focus ring turns very nicely and smoothly even after all these years, and that speaks well for the quality of its manufacture. Minimum focus distance is 5 feet or 1.7 meters, so it doesn't quite go as close as the Vivitar did, but again it's got lots of reach, so that doesn't cause too many problems. The aperture ring is at the back. It runs from f2.8 to f22, so the same number, rather the same range of aperture variations. It has an M42 mount, which you can see at the back there, which I should have pointed out on the previous one. So it's nice and simple and straightforward. It's not got an exotic mount or anything you're going to have problems with. Very easy to adapt. And it's very nicely made. It's at least as nicely made as any other lens, as any Western lens that I've used. No problem at all with the quality of its manufacture. Now, I'm not quite sure of the DNA of this lens. The East German photographic industry had inputs from Carl Zeiss Jena. It had inputs from Meyer Optik, who I believe was responsible for much of the DNA of the Pentacon 50mm lens. So who knows, it could be one of those, it could be a combination of those, it could be an entirely original design. Now the Pentacon 50, the little 50mm Pentacon that I've often used and I think was in the video last week, that's a nice lens, it shoots well, no problems with it. So how is this one going to shoot by comparison? Well, actually pretty well. It shoots very, very nicely. It tends to make generally cool sort of images. They're shifted slightly towards the blue. Some lenses are quite warm. This one isn't. This one has a cool look, which personally I quite like. I do quite like the cool look. Colours are very nice. It makes very strong colours with plenty of saturation, real big pumped up colours, which again personally I rather like. If that's not your cup of tea, then you can perhaps shoot in something other than vivid or bring those colours, that saturation, down a little in post. But personally I like a lens that gives good strong colour, and this is one such. It's much more contrasty than the Vivitar, not quite so contrasty as the Minolta, and pretty far from being as contrasty as the Tair. So I would say this is a relatively low contrast lens. That's okay if you like the low contrast look. I think it can be very nice depending on the situation. So a fairly low contrast lens. It's sharp enough wide open. It's not a paragon of sharpness wide open, and you can see a little bit of softness. So I think perhaps the f2.8 setting on this lens is really, don't forget this is a lens from the film days, so really I think it's just to let in that bit more light so you can work in conditions where the light isn't so great, and not worry too much, compromise a little bit on sharpness so that you can get the light in. Not a particularly sharp lens, but sharp enough, shot wide open. If you want razor sharpness, it'll give you that, but it's best stopped down, and really you want to go to 5.6 or probably f8 to get the absolute sharpest out of this lens, but then of course you're going to sacrifice a little bit of blur. Now the blur on this lens is pretty tidy. It's fairly conventional. It's certainly not as wild as that which you get from the Vivitar. It will make some bubbles from specular highlights, from point light sources, but it's nothing like as eager or as ready to make those bubbles as the Vivitar is. This one's much more restrained, much more conventional. It's broadly on a par with the Minolta. They have kind of similar background blur characteristics, though the Minolta, I have to say, is a little bit nicer. This one has one or two harsh spots that it's probably best to shoot around. It's not difficult to do that, but you do have to be aware of it. Both of these lenses make quite a contrast from with the Tair. The blur from the Tair is unflappable at all times. Whatever the distance, it is uniformly smooth, and that's a real achievement in a lens, especially in a vintage lens. And yet, given that it's so smooth, saying that it's so smooth, it's not bland in the way that modern lenses are. It's just very, very nice, and it does preserve some character, it does preserve some quirks, but it's just lovely. It makes every image feel nice. It's got that very nice feeling sort of blur. It's likeable blur, and the Pentacon can't quite match it, but it's still pretty nice, but it really can't quite match that of the Tair. And as I say, it can't quite match the pleasant feel of the Minolta, the lack of harsh points in the Minolta either. None of these three lenses, perhaps it goes without saying, can match the outright wildness and anarchic nature of the Vivitar. Neither the Tair nor the Vivitar nor the Minolta, and you wouldn't necessarily want them to either. But the Vivitar really is out there on its own for blur. I've not really seen anything quite like that in a 135 before. The Pentacon's a good and capable lens. It's got good colours. It's pretty sharp, especially if you stop it down. You can get some real nice razor sharpness out of it. It's got nice background blur that is pleasant and pleasing for most of the time, and it makes very nice images, and many of those images really are very nice indeed. This is a capable little optic, a very competent and capable lens. I like it and I really enjoyed using it, but it doesn't match the capabilities of the Tair, and it can't make images like the Tair or even like the Minolta, to be honest. The Tair makes absolutely outstanding images, and it doesn't have any compromises. It's very sharp from wide open, and I mean really razor sharp from wide open. It's got uniformly soft blur, and it's also got an X factor, a quality that I just can't put my finger on, something undefinable. It makes very deep and resonant images with very strong contrast. More than that, it seems to make images with slightly higher dynamic range. That is, it renders the blacks and the whites very, very cleanly, and all points betwixt and between are very clear and very clearly defined. So if a lens can contribute to high dynamic range, the Tair does it. It's got a much fuller range of nuances, of light, of dark, and of colour. It's fuller, it's more potent, and it makes far more pleasing images. In fact, the Tair 11 is probably the nicest 135 I've used, bar none. But the Minolta is not far behind. It's got great colour, not quite as deep and resonant as the Tair, but still very, very nice. It's very sharp, but I think the Tair just takes it by a whisker. It's got strong and punchy contrast. The blur is very nice, very pleasant. Again, not quite as nice as the Tair. It does have one or two harsh spots, whereas the Tair doesn't seem to. And I have to say the Minolta 2 is that little bit nicer than the Pentacon. As for the Vivitar, well, that one's out there on its own. Whether I've got a faulty copy or not, I really don't know. But I consider it a fortunate fault if it is indeed a fault. And I really like the images, the rather kooky, rather strange, rather technically not that great images that this little Vivitar makes. So what does this test show? Well, you can buy a budget fast 135. That is possible. But based on this admittedly fairly limited test, the more expensive lenses on test here, the Minolta and the Tair 11, give noticeably better results. In fact, significantly better. For limited use, one of these cheap 135s, fast 135s, would be absolutely fine. Or if you want to try a fast 135, you're not sure if you like the focal length or the amount of blur a fast 135 makes, try a cheap one first. Get the feel of it. Doesn't matter if it's not technically perfect. It'll give you a feel for that focal length and it'll get you used to working within that focal length. But it might be better to buy a slower 135, an f3.5 135. There are many of those around at very cheap prices from the major manufacturers. The Olympus f3.5 135 is a very nice lens, as is the Zeiss Jena 135 3.5, as is the Pentax Takumar 135 f3.5, and there's a whole host of others, Canon, Nikon, and all the other manufacturers. Just take your pick. If you do use or buy one of those slightly slower 135s, you're going to get better optical quality. You're going to sacrifice a tiny bit of blur, but with a lens this long, you're really hardly going to notice. So I think, unless you particularly want a fast 135, don't get a fast 135. Get a slightly slower 135, an f3.5 135. Or, if that's not a good course of action for you, save up your money, buy a Tair 11. There is no better fast 135 that I have yet tried. So that's it from me for now. Let me just tell you quickly what's coming up in the next episode. You might have seen sitting here resplendently on the table in front of me this beautiful little camera. This is the Fujifilm X-E1, the little brother to the X Pro one. It's got the same sensor, it's got the same electronics, it's got the same incredible film-like image quality, and we are going to be reviewing this wonderful little camera next week. I've had it for about an hour. It was delivered about an hour ago, and already I've fallen in love with it. So tune in next week if you're interested in that camera. We've got lots more vintage lens reviews coming up. Let me know again in the comments box if there's anything you'd like to see. 135s were mentioned last time. Various other topics were mentioned last time, and I'm bringing those all together and seeing what's possible to do, and however most people want me to do those things, then I'll do them. Do let me know in the comments what you would like to see, and I'll do my best to fulfill it for you. So that's it from me for now. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell before you go. It helps these smaller channels to grow, and we do need to grow. If you'd like to help this channel to grow and develop, you can do that at patreon.com/Zenography, and head on over to Patreon to see what rewards are on offer and to consider whether or not you'd like to do that. As ever, thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you next time for some more Zenography.